June 1, 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, Oahu. The tropical air was thick with the smell of oil and steel. Sparks flew from the hull of a wounded giant, the USS Yorktown, her decks torn. Bulkheads twisted, scars still fresh from the Coral Sea welders worked without pause. Their torches hissing in the humid night, the clang of metal echoed across the docks, blending with the low rumble of generators and shouted orders. Every man knew the truth. This ship should have been months in dry dock, but time had vanished across the Pacific. Japan was moving again, toward a tiny atoll called Midway. If the Americans failed to stop them, Hawaii could be next. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the edge of the dock, watching floodlights sweep across the hull. He had ordered the impossible. Make her fight ready in 72 hours. Not perfect, not beautiful, just ready to sail. And as midnight neared, the crippled carrier began to look alive again, patched, fueled, and bracing for a battle no one thought she could reach. The Pacific War was about to change forever. When 1942 began, the Pacific belonged to Japan. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, the rising sun stretched across half the ocean in 6 months. Japan had seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, its navy, fast disciplined and battle-tested, ruled the seas with 6 powerful fleet carriers that had delivered every victory since December 7, 1941. For the United States, it was a season of retreat. The Pacific Fleet was battered. Battleships lay twisted in the shallows of Pearl Harbor. Guam had fallen. Wake Island silenced. Every mile westward seemed lost to the red circles of Japan's empire. Only a handful of aircraft carriers, fragile, floating cities of steel, stood between Japan and the American mainland. Among them was Yorktown CV-5, one of the Navy's most capable carriers, commissioned in 1937. She had already seen combat in the Atlantic before being rushed to the Pacific. In early 1942, her decks had launched strike after strike against Japanese positions, her crew hardened by long months at sea. But in May 1942, Yorktown faced her greatest trial at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The battle marked a new chapter in warfare, the first in history where opposing ships never saw one another. Planes, not guns, decided the outcome between May 4th and 8th. Carrier aircraft from both sides fought in shifting skies over the Coral Sea, hundreds of miles apart. Yorktown's planes had helped sink the Japanese light carrier Sho, the first major Japanese carrier lost in the war, yet the cost was heavy. On May 8th, enemy dive bombers found Yorktown. 3 bombs struck home, tearing through her flight deck, collapsing compartments, and igniting fires deep below. For hours her crew battled smoke and flame the carrier listed, her power flickering. Many believed she would go down like so many ships before her, but Yorktown refused to die through grit, discipline, and desperate firefighting. The crew stabilized her. She limped back to Pearl Harbor under her own power, damaged, wounded, but afloat. When she arrived on May 27, 1942, naval inspectors delivered grim news. Full repairs would take 3 months. Her engines were battered, decks buckled, lifts misaligned. Every calculation said she'd miss the next battle. But that next battle couldn't wait. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, fragments of coded traffic that hinted at a massive operation in early June. The target was something called AF. Analysts at Station HYPO in Hawaii suspected it meant Midway Atoll, a tiny dot of coral halfway between Asia and America. If Japan captured it, the U.S. defensive line would collapse. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, faced an impossible decision. The U.S. had only 2 operational carriers left, Enterprise and Hornet, against Japan's 4 veteran carriers. It wasn't enough without Yorktown. The odds were suicide. So Nimitz made a choice that defied every manual and regulation. He ordered Yorktown back into battle within 72 hours. The order spread through the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard like an electric current. Thousands of workers poured onto the docks, welders, electricians, mechanics, carpenters, many still haunted by the smoke of December 7th. They worked in 12-hour shifts. 3 crews rotating without rest. Naval engineers rerouted damaged piping, cut away twisted steel, patched her deck with new plating, rewired generators, and replaced lift motors that had burned out during Coral Sea. Fuel lines hissed, cranes roared, the smell of paint mixed with salt air. Every hammer strike echoed with urgency, because somewhere beyond the horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already on the move. By the end of the 3rd day, Yorktown looked whole again, not perfect, not polished, but seaworthy. Her scars were sealed. Her decks straight enough for aircraft to fly. Mechanics declared her engines stable. Though one was still limping, even her air group, VB3, VV-3, VT3, scrambled back aboard. Some men reporting directly from the hospital ward. At dawn on May 30th, the battered carrier sailed out of Pearl Harbor, her patched hull glinting beneath the morning sun as she slipped into the open Pacific. No one aboard knew whether she'd survive the coming storm. But they knew one thing. If she didn't go, Midway might fall, and the war could be lost. The ocean was vast, the enemy invisible, and the countdown to the most decisive battle in the Pacific had begun. The Japanese believed the Americans were broken. After Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, Tokyo's leaders assumed the U.S. Navy had neither the strength nor the will to fight a decisive engagement. Their next move, codenamed Operation Me, would confirm that belief. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, planned to strike Midway Island, a tiny U.S. outpost 2,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. His strategy was audacious: lure what remained of the American carrier force into the open, destroy it, and force the United States to the negotiating table. Midway's value was both practical and psychological. It was America's forward outpost, its last shield before Hawaii. To lose it would expose the Pacific heart of the United States. Yamamoto's plan called for a massive fleet, over 200 ships, including 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had bombed Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They were veterans, commanded by seasoned aircrews who had never known defeat. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that his secret plan was no longer secret. Inside a low, windowless room at Pearl Harbor, known as Station HYPO, a team of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to break Japanese codes, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. The team had been intercepting enemy communications for months, strings of numbers, coded phrases, and call signs buried in radio chatter. Slowly, they pieced together a pattern. By late May 1942, Rochefort was confident that AF, the target mentioned repeatedly in Japanese messages, referred to Midway, but Washington demanded proof. To confirm their theory, the station devised a clever test. Midway sent a false message in plain English, claiming its freshwater plant had failed 2 days later. Japanese signals reported that AF is short on water. It was all the confirmation Nimitz needed. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz began one of the boldest gambles in naval history. He ordered his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the newly patched Yorktown, to position northeast of Midway. They would wait in silence, hidden by ocean and cloud, ready to ambush the Japanese fleet the moment it appeared. For Nimitz, intelligence had become the great equalizer. The Americans would go into battle outnumbered, but not unprepared. Back at Pearl Harbor, Yorktown's departure had inspired quiet disbelief. Her hull still bore the scars of Coral Sea. Some compartments were sealed shut because repairs hadn't finished. Many of her crew slept beside exposed bulkheads where the heat of torches still lingered. Yet morale was unshaken. They called her the Fighting Lady, a symbol of defiance. Her air group trained en route, pilots memorizing deck signals and fuel ratios, Many had never flown alongside Enterprise or Hornet before, but in the coming fight, coordination would mean survival. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto's fleet advanced in 4 separate task forces, spread over thousands of miles of ocean, a complex plan requiring perfect timing. He expected to surprise the Americans. Instead, he was sailing into a trap. On June 3rd, U.S. reconnaissance planes from Midway sighted enemy ships on the horizon, transports, cruisers, and destroyers heading toward the atoll. The report flashed across the Pacific. Enemy sighted, bearing 320. The waiting American carriers came to life. Aboard Yorktown, alarms blared. Crews manned stations. Mechanics checked torpedoes, and flight crews strapped in her patch deck shone dull in the morning sun. The white wake trailing behind as she turned into the wind. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, watched the horizon with calm resolve. He knew how fragile his ship was, yet she was the only reason the U.S. could match Japan carrier for carrier. By dawn the next day, June 4, 1942, 3 U.S. carriers lay in wait northeast of Midway. Their positions were hidden, their aircraft armed and fueled. Below decks, sailors whispered prayers above. Clouds drifted across the endless blue, the same skies that would soon burn with fire and smoke. The stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history, a clash that would decide not only the fate of Midway, but the future of the Pacific War itself. And at the heart of it all was a ship that should never have been there, the USS Yorktown, reborn from ruin, ready to fight one last time. The ambush was set. The hunters and the hunted were now only hours apart. For the men aboard Yorktown, the smell of paint and oil never faded. It clung to their uniforms and meals, a reminder of how close their ship had come to ruin. Many still bore bandages from Coral Sea. Some had lost friends whose names were freshly etched into the roll of the dead. Yet there was no ceremony, no mourning. The time for grief had been stolen by the urgency of war. They worked, slept, and fought in a rhythm of exhaustion in the hangar bay. Mechanics repaired bullet-riddled aircraft using scavenged parts. Pilots reviewed strike maps scratched onto the mess tables. Radio operators practiced code phrases until they blurred into instinct. There was pride, but also quiet fear. Everyone knew Yorktown wasn't ready beneath her patch deck. Compartments still leaked, pumps ran constantly to keep water out. The ship's engines groaned under strain, but sailors had learned to hide worry behind routine, coffee in tin cups, songs on the lower decks, laughter that felt half real. What sustained them wasn't just orders. It was the belief that this ship, against all odds, still mattered. When Yorktown joined Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway, sailors looked out across the dark ocean and whispered what many felt. If we fail here, there's nowhere left to fall back. Each man aboard, engineer, pilot, deckhand, carried a piece of that weight, and as dawn approached on June 4th, they prepared to meet an enemy whose legend stretched across the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was not decided by brute strength, but by timing, minutes, even seconds, separating survival from annihilation. American strategy relied on stealth, hidden northeast of the atoll. The 3 U.S. carriers waited in silence. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet after Admiral Halsey fell ill, would coordinate with Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Aboard Yorktown, Fletcher, senior in command, held tactical control but trusted Spruance's sharp instincts. Their plan was simple but fragile. Allow Japanese forces to strike Midway first, then launch a coordinated counterattack while the enemy carriers were vulnerable, their decks cluttered with refueling aircraft. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese aircraft began their assault on Midway Island. Bombs fell in fiery bursts, setting oil tanks ablaze and tearing runways apart, but Midway's defenders struck back, sending waves of Marine bombers against the invading fleet. Most were shot down, yet in those desperate attacks, valuable intelligence was gained, the enemy's location, heading, and formation. From that moment, the American counterstrike began. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launched waves of aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Each launch took minutes that felt like hours. Deck crews worked with machine precision, guiding planes into the wind, engines roaring as they leapt from the deck toward distant specks on the horizon. But coordination in open ocean warfare was chaos disguised as order. Clouds scattered formations, radio signals failed. Fuel ran low, some squadrons never found their targets, others flew into flak without escort. It was a battle fought in fragments, one side searching, the other striking, both on the edge of exhaustion. Yorktown's squadrons were among the most disciplined. Their attack groups would soon carve a path through that confusion. But before they reached the enemy, other Americans would pay the price for opening the skies. By 1942, the aircraft carrier had become the new capital ship, a floating airfield whose reach could span hundreds of miles. But its power rested on fragile machinery and human synchronization. Aboard Yorktown, her technological heart was still half rebuilt. One of her boilers had been bypassed. Radar systems flickered under salt-crusted wires, yet her air operations center functioned with remarkable precision, plotting intercepts, fuel reserves, and attack coordinates by hand. Her aircraft, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Grumman F-4F Wildcats, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, represented the cutting edge of 1942 aviation, but each model carried strengths and flaws that would define the battle. The Devastators, slow and lightly armored, would soon prove fatally outdated. The Dauntless, though rugged, required courage bordering on madness. Pilots had to dive nearly vertically through anti-aircraft fire to release bombs with any accuracy. Japanese technology, by contrast, had reached its apex. The IS-6M0 was unmatched in agility and climb rate. Japanese carrier decks operated with near-industrial speed and discipline. In every technical metric, aircraft range, pilot experience, and ordnance handling, Japan still held the edge. The only domain where the U.S. held superiority was radar and intelligence. Yorktown's early warning radar gave her precious minutes to prepare for airstrikes, a difference measured in survival. Even her damage control systems, refined after Pearl Harbor, reflected a hard-earned lesson: watertight compartments, emergency pumps, and new firefighting foams allowed her crew to contain damage faster than any Japanese ship could hope to match. But the technology alone was never enough. What mattered was how men used it, and whether the ship could endure long enough to use it again. As the morning of June 4th dawned, Yorktown's patched decks gleamed beneath the pale sunlight. Pilots lined up for briefing, flight leaders tracing invisible paths across the air below. Mechanics checked bomb racks and refueled engines. In the stillness before takeoff, one thought echoed through the corridors. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but this time they weren't blind. The tools of survival, intelligence, timing, and courage had aligned. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy's carriers waited, unaware that their own destruction was already taking flight. The ships moved toward contact, the air filling with the sound of rising engines and gathering fate. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz understood that victory in the Pacific would not come through numbers, but through nerve. In late May 1942, his office in Pearl Harbor became the nerve center of the entire American war effort. With limited carriers, few replacement planes, and an exhausted fleet, he had to gamble everything on intelligence and trust that the enemy would behave as predicted. His calm, analytical demeanor masked the magnitude of that gamble. The U.S. Navy was sending nearly all it had left into one battle. If Yorktown, Enterprise, or Hornet were lost, there would be no second chance the Pacific would lie open to Japan. Nimitz's strength was in delegation. He entrusted operational command to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a seasoned carrier leader aboard Yorktown, and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, an intellectual strategist with a destroyer background who replaced the ill Admiral Halsey, the pairing was unusual, one cautious, one bold, but Nimitz believed that balance could deliver results. Each commander carried enormous pressure. Spruance had never led a carrier task force in battle. Fletcher knew Yorktown was barely seaworthy, yet both men shared a quiet understanding. Hesitation would mean annihilation. When radio silence fell over the fleet, Nimitz could only wait, listening to static reports from Midway. Tracing enemy movements across maps littered with pins and coffee stains, he was gambling not just ships, but the morale of a nation still haunted by December 7th. Leadership, in that moment, meant faith in men, in machines, and in the precision of intelligence. And on the other side of the ocean, another admiral believed the same, but with far greater arrogance. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had designed Operation A with surgical precision. The Japanese Navy, at that point, was undefeated, its pilots elite, its ships meticulously maintained. Each victory had seemed inevitable, each campaign flawlessly executed. But success had bred overconfidence. The Japanese High Command dismissed the possibility of American carriers interfering at Midway. Their assumptions were reinforced by incomplete intelligence. They believed Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea. In their view, only 2 enemy carriers remained. Yamamoto's fleet advanced in sprawling formation, the main striking force under Vice Admiral Koichi Nagamo, followed by invasion transports, battleships, and a distant decoy group. The plan's complexity was its flaw. It required flawless timing and communication across thousands of miles. Nagamo, commanding the carrier group, was cautious by nature, a tactician who preferred certainty before committing to full-scale engagement. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each carried around 70 aircraft, manned by veterans who had bombed Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. On the morning of June 4th, Nagamo's pilot struck Midway Atoll with devastating precision. Yet as his first wave returned, scattered reports began arriving, U.S. aircraft sighted at sea, possibly carrier-based. The moment demanded a decision. Should he launch his reserve aircraft immediately, armed with torpedoes to strike at the enemy? Or should he rearm them with bombs for a second attack on Midway? Nagamo hesitated, torn between conflicting reports. He ordered a change, the torpedoes to be swapped for bombs. Then back again minutes later as new intelligence arrived. It was a small delay. Barely 30 minutes in total, but in naval warfare, 30 minutes could decide the fate of nations. That delay would prove fatal. While Japanese crews worked frantically on crowded decks, refueling and rearming aircraft, the American dive bombers, guided by luck, courage, and timing, were already inbound. The Battle of Midway was fought not only with bombs and torpedoes, but with belief for the Americans. This was redemption, a chance to strike back after Pearl Harbor's humiliation for the Japanese. It was destiny, the final blow meant to seal their empire's supremacy across the Pacific. Every pilot carried that weight differently. American crews felt the fear of inexperience. Many had trained only months before the war. They flew outdated planes into the heart of the world's most skilled navy, knowing the odds, but beneath fear burned something deeper: defiance. The Pacific fleet had suffered too much to surrender another inch of ocean. Japanese pilots, in contrast, carried an unbroken confidence. They had never faced defeat. Their doctrine prized precision and perfection, traits that made them formidable. But also brittle. They flew with honor but underestimated the will of their opponents. In both camps, the psychology of war played out in silence on Yorktown. Chaplains held brief services on the hangar deck. Pilots traced small crosses or lucky charms onto their dashboards. Engineers whispered to the ship itself, as if urging it to hold together one more day. Aboard the Japanese carriers, flight crews performed ancient Shinto rituals before takeoff, bowing before the rising sun flagged to them. Each mission was sacred duty. To their enemies, it was survival. When the two forces met in the skies above Midway, faith collided with fate. It wasn't numbers that would decide the outcome, but a series of human moments, decisions made under stress, instincts tested in seconds. At that intersection of fear and courage, the course of the Pacific War would turn. Both fleets were now within striking distance, engines thundered, bomb racks clanged shut, and above the vast Pacific, clouds gathered for the storm. June 4, 1942, 6:20 a.m., Midway Atoll. The sky over Midway burned orange as Japanese bombers descended. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. Their tracers clawing at the clouds. Explosions tore across the small coral island. Fuel tanks erupted. Barracks shattered, and the airfield vanished under fire from above. Japanese pilots saw flames licking the runways and believed victory was near. But even as the first wave banked for home, American spotters relayed a critical message. Enemy carriers sighted, bearing 320. The moment every U.S. commander had waited for had arrived. Aboard the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The decks roared to life, crews sprinted to stations. Ordnance handlers rolled bombs into position. And pilots strapped into cockpits, slick with sweat, engines roared one after another, their propellers carving the humid air into a rising storm of sound. At 7 a.m., Yorktown began launching her first strike group, Torpedo Squadron 3. Led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, took off in TBD Devastators, slow, obsolete aircraft armed with unreliable torpedoes. Their mission: locate and attack the Japanese carriers head-on, no matter the cost. They knew the odds. The Devastator was outdated. Its top speed barely half that of the Japanese Zero fighter. Most of its crews had watched entire squadrons vanish in earlier battles, yet none hesitated, one by one. Their planes vanished into the horizon, wings glinting in the rising sun. By 9 a.m., chaos ruled the skies. American squadrons approached the enemy fleet in scattered formations. Victims of poor navigation and communication failures, torpedo squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise struck first and were annihilated. Zeros tore through them with merciless precision. Flaming wrecks falling into the sea, not one hit landed. But their sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters downward, away from the clouds above, and it was from those clouds that fate descended. At 10:22 a.m., Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, spotted the Japanese carriers below them. Akagi and Kaga maneuvered, decks crowded with refueling aircraft, explosive-laden bombs and fuel hoses littered the surface, a floating inferno waiting to happen. McCluskey led his dauntless bombers into a near-vertical dive. The wind screamed around them, anti-aircraft fire filled the air. Black bursts tearing through the sky. Pilots ignored it, their eyes locked on the moving deck far below. Seconds later, the first bomb struck. One exploded near Kaga's bridge, igniting fuel lines. Another punched through her hangar deck. Detonating ammunition flames erupted across her length. Within minutes, she was a furnace. Then Akagi was hit, a single 1,000-pound bomb piercing her flight deck and detonating in the hangar, where armed planes awaited launch. Fire spread uncontrollably. From miles away, Yorktown's crew watched the distant pillars of smoke rise, unaware that their own turn was coming. At 10:30 a.m., Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Max Leslie, arrived from another angle and found Soryu. Their attack was surgical. 3 bombs struck amidships, tearing open her hangar and igniting refueling aircraft. Within minutes, the carrier was engulfed in fire. In the span of 5 minutes, Japan's naval supremacy, built over decades, collapsed. 3 of its 4 carriers were burning. Hundreds of veteran airmen were trapped aboard, their experience lost to flame and smoke. The ocean that had once belonged to Japan was now filled with wreckage and silence. But the battle wasn't over. One Japanese carrier remained, Hiryu, and she was coming for Yorktown. At 11 a.m., Japanese reconnaissance spotted Yorktown's task force commander Tomio Kaku, led 18 dive bombers toward her position. Yorktown's radar detected them early, giving her fighter cover. Wildcats from VF-3 timed to intercept. They shot down several attackers, but too many slipped through. At 12:20 p.m., the first bomb struck. One hit near the island superstructure. Another tore through the flight deck. Explosions rocked the ship. Fires spread rapidly. Power failed, and black smoke rose into the sky. Crewmen fought desperately to save her. Damage control parties flooded burning compartments, patched ruptures, and restored electricity within minutes. By 2 p.m., Yorktown was back underway, wounded but alive. The ship that wasn't supposed to sail had just survived a full-scale carrier strike. For a moment, it seemed she had beaten fate itself. But Hiryu wasn't finished. A second wave was already inbound, carrying torpedoes meant to finish the job. And as Yorktown's crew scrambled once more to battle stations, no one yet knew they were living through the most decisive hours of the Pacific War. The ocean stilled again, heavy with smoke and silence, a pause before the next attack. June 4, 1942. 2:30 p.m. Smoke still rose from Yorktown's deck as her damage control teams raced to contain new flare-ups. Hoses snaked across the hangar bay. Men coughed through smoke and oil fumes, and the sound of splintering steel echoed through the ship's frame. Despite the destruction, Yorktown was still afloat, proof of training, discipline, and courage under fire. But over the horizon, another formation approached, Hiryu's second wave. 12 torpedo bombers, escorted by Zeros, skimmed the waves at mast height. Using the sun and sea glare as cover, they were the last remaining offensive force of the Imperial Japanese Navy that day. Their orders were simple: finish Yorktown. Radar picked them up at 2:40 p.m. Fighters scrambled, guns roared, and the sky turned into a web of tracers. The first enemy aircraft went down in flames, but more pressed through. At 2:45 p.m., the first torpedo struck Yorktown's port side. Seconds later, another slammed into her midsection. The explosions ripped open her hull, flooding her boilers and engines. The ship listed violently to port, power failing once again. Inside, chaos ruled. Men were thrown from ladders, compartments flooded instantly, and corridors filled with smoke and seawater. Abandoned ship. Came the reluctant order. One by one, sailors leapt into the oil-slicked sea as destroyers circled to pick them up. By 3 p.m., the proud carrier lay dead in the water, silent, leaning hard to one side, her once bustling flight deck half submerged. Yet even in that grim moment, Yorktown had already played her part. Her aircraft had crippled Soryu, and her resilience had absorbed 2 full enemy strikes, buying the U.S. fleet precious hours to strike back. Admiral Spruance seized the moment. At 3:30 p.m., he ordered Enterprise and Hornet to launch a counterattack against the last surviving Japanese carrier, Hiryu. High above the Pacific, American dauntless dive bombers formed up for their final assault. Among them was Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who would later recall seeing Hiryu as a glowing ember in a field of blue. At 5 p.m., they dove. The first bomb struck Hiryu's forward flight deck. A second tore through her aft hangar. Within minutes, secondary explosions erupted across her deck as fueled planes detonated. Flames engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Hiryu's crew fought desperately to save her, flooding compartments and jettisoning munitions. But the inferno could not be contained. Admiral Yamaguchi, aboard Hiryu, refused to abandon ship. He chose to go down with his command, saying simply, "The fate of our empire rests here." As the sun dipped low over the Pacific, Hiryu burned until nightfall, her silhouette framed by fire. At 9 p.m., the order was given to scuttle her. She slipped beneath the waves, the last of Japan's 4 carriers destroyed. By the end of June 4th, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once invincible, had lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Americans had lost one, Yorktown. The scale of reversal was unprecedented. In less than a day, Japan's main striking force had been annihilated, not by sheer numbers, but by intelligence, courage, and timing. The ocean that had echoed with the hum of Japanese dominance now carried only the hiss of burning oil and drifting wreckage. Still, the victory carried a price. As night fell, Yorktown remained afloat, but crippled salvage crews reboarded her, assessing damage and patching bulkheads. It seemed possible she might yet be towed to safety. For 2 days, tugs worked tirelessly, dragging her slowly eastward. Then, on June 6th, disaster struck again. A Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped past the destroyer screen. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Yahashi Tanabe, spotted Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond alongside her. Aiding in repairs, he fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, 1 hit Hammond. The destroyer exploded instantly and sank within minutes. Yorktown, already fatally wounded, began to list once more. The sea poured into her open hull. And this time, there was no saving her. For hours, the damaged carrier drifted silently, her decks tilting ever steeper toward the sea. Then, on the morning of June 7, 1942, she rolled over and slipped beneath the waves, stern first, bow rising, briefly before vanishing. The ocean closed over her without ceremony. Only a spreading slick of oil remained, glinting like black glass beneath the early light. She had lived just long enough to help change the course of the war. And in that moment, the transformation was complete. Yorktown, built to project American power, had become a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and rebirth. The U.S. Navy that emerged from Midway was no longer the cautious, battered force of 1941. It was an evolving machine, learning, adapting, striking back with precision and purpose. The loss of Yorktown was felt deeply across the fleet. Yet every sailor knew what it meant. Her final stand had bought America time. Time to build, to recover, and to turn defense into dominance. In just 72 hours, she had risen, fought, and fallen, but left behind the spark of a new era. The fires of Midway faded into darkness, but their glow marked the birth of America's counteroffensive and the beginning of Japan's long retreat. June 8, 1942, the Pacific, silent again. The smoke had cleared, and the ocean that once thundered with engines and explosions now stretched empty to the horizon. Wreckage drifted in slow spirals, twisted steel, shattered wings, fragments of lifeboats. Somewhere below, 4 Japanese carriers lay on the seabed, surrounded by the remains of hundreds of aircraft and thousands of sailors. The Battle of Midway was over. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic beyond imagination. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the very same carriers that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, were gone. Along with them perished more than 3,000 men, including some of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, flight leaders, and deck crews. The destruction was more than material. It was generational. Japan's elite carrier airmen, trained through years of rigorous combat exercises, could not be easily replaced. Their deaths left a void that no amount of new planes or hastily trained recruits could fill. The shock rippled through the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, received the report with disbelief. His decisive blow against the United States had instead backfired into disaster. Japan's dream of total control over the Pacific had evaporated in 4 hours of battle. Still, Yamamoto tried to salvage pride. He ordered his fleet to continue eastward, searching for any remaining American ships, but the element of surprise, his most prized weapon, was gone. American reconnaissance aircraft shadowed his movements, forcing him to retreat back toward Japan's strongholds. The grand offensive that was meant to draw the U.S. into annihilation had instead ended with his own carriers in flames. On the American side, the mood was one of disbelief and quiet triumph. When word reached Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the coded message: 4 enemy carriers sunk, ours damaged, Midway secure. He reportedly stood in silence for a moment before saying only, "This changes everything." At first, even Washington doubted the scale of the victory. Reporters were told only that U.S. forces had won a significant engagement, but as more details emerged, 4 Japanese carriers sunk for the loss of 1, the realization spread that the Pacific balance had shifted permanently. For the men of Yorktown, there was grief alongside pride. Survivors gathered aboard rescue ships, their faces blackened with oil and exhaustion. Many had lost friends, bunkmates, and officers they'd served with for years. Yet even in mourning, they knew what they had achieved. They had helped stop Japan's expansion, proving that the Imperial Navy could bleed and lose. Across Midway Atoll, the defenders surveyed the damage. The airfield lay in ruins, craters pocking the coral runways, but the island still stood, the garrison that had braced for invasion. Now raised an American flag above the shattered control tower, it flapped in the wind, visible to passing aircraft, a small but powerful signal that Midway had not fallen. In intelligence rooms in Washington and London, analysts pored over intercepted Japanese communications. It became clear that the enemy had not simply been defeated, they had been deceived. The success of American codebreakers, who had uncovered Japan's Midway plans weeks earlier, was now recognized as one of the greatest intelligence coups in history. From that point onward, Japan could no longer count on secrecy. Every move risked exposure, and every American commander knew it. Yet amid the celebration, one fact stood heavy in the air: the United States had paid a price of its own. Yorktown, Hammond, and over 300 American sailors and aviators had been lost. For many of the survivors, the victory felt bittersweet, a triumph soaked in sacrifice. Still, the meaning was unmistakable. Midway was not just a battle won. It was the turning of the tide. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan was on the defensive, and America had taken the initiative. The ocean that had once seemed endless and hostile now held the promise of advance. But victory was only the beginning. What came next would define the rest of the Pacific War. The slow, grinding push westward toward Japan's empire. The echoes of Midway carried far beyond the Pacific horizon. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff struggled to contain the news. Official bulletins spoke vaguely of a naval setback. Avoiding any mention of carriers lost, civilians were told that Japan had achieved its objectives, a lie meant to preserve morale. But within military circles, the truth was impossible to hide. The Empire's striking arm, once thought invincible, had been severed. Admiral Yamamoto, haunted by the defeat, confided to a close aide, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." His words, once theoretical, now felt like prophecy fulfilled. Japan's naval power was broken at its core. It still possessed battleships and cruisers, but its offensive strength, its carrier aviation, had been gutted. The highly trained pilots lost at Midway could not be replaced. Their replacements, rushed through truncated training programs, lacked the skill to compete with the increasingly disciplined U.S. Navy aviators who now dominated the skies. Strategically, Midway changed everything. Before June 1942, Japan had moved freely across the Pacific, capturing island after island from Hong Kong to the Solomons. After Midway, that momentum stopped cold. The Imperial Navy shifted from expansion to defense, forced to guard its sprawling empire instead of extending it. For the Allies, it was a rebirth. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, had proven it could strike back and win. Factories across the mainland accelerated production. New carriers, Essex-class ships, began sliding off shipways at a pace Japan could never match. Aircraft production multiplied, and pilot training programs expanded exponentially. Within a year, America would launch more carriers than Japan had built in its entire pre-war history. Midway's influence also extended into doctrine and design. Naval planners recognized that the era of the battleship was over. The aircraft carrier had become the decisive weapon of modern warfare, a mobile airfield capable of striking anywhere on the ocean. The lessons of Midway would shape naval strategy for generations. For the men who fought there, the memories never faded. Survivors of Yorktown carried the scent of burning oil and salt water with them for life. Many described the eerie calm that followed her sinking, the sense that something vast had shifted in the world, though they could not yet name it. In post-war interviews, pilot Dusty Kleiss, who scored hits on Kaga and Hiryu, reflected, "We weren't heroes, we were just doing what needed to be done, but that one day, turned the tide of the war." Historians would later agree. Midway was not the largest battle of the war, nor the longest, but it was decisive. It ended Japan's offensive capability and handed initiative to the Allies. From that moment on, the question was no longer if the Allies could win, but when. In the months that followed, U.S. forces moved quickly to capitalize. The Guadalcanal campaign began in August 1942, marking the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. Every bomb dropped, every landing made, traced its origin to the victory at Midway. Meanwhile, the wreck of Yorktown settled quietly 16,000 feet below the surface. She lay upright, her decks eerily intact, as though still awaiting aircraft to launch. Her story faded into the greater narrative of the war, yet her spirit endured. When the war finally ended in 1945, Midway was remembered not just as a turning point, but as a resurrection, a moment when the United States, bloodied but unbroken, reclaimed control of the Pacific. For Japan, it marked the beginning of decline, a slow descent into defeat, sealed not by one blow, but by a chain of losses that began with that single battle near a small coral atoll. And for history, it was proof that information, courage, and adaptability could overcome superior numbers and technology. The legacy of Yorktown and Midway lives on not in monuments, but in the way navies think, plan, and fight. The idea that resilience, not perfection, decides wars. As the Pacific grew calm again, the names of those ships, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, became symbols of endurance. From ruin, they had forged the path to victory. In the long arc of history, few battles alter the destiny of nations. Midway was one of them. It was not won by overwhelming strength, but by preparation, intelligence, and the quiet resolve of men who refused to surrender. In just 3 days, 72 hours of chaos and courage, the course of the Pacific War turned. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable met its first true defeat, and the world glimpsed a different future. For the United States, the Battle of Midway was more than a victory, it was redemption. 6 months earlier, the Pacific Fleet had been in ruins at Pearl Harbor. Now, those same sailors and airmen had risen from that destruction to deliver a blow so precise, so unexpected, that it shattered Japan's strategic confidence forever. At the heart of that story stood USS Yorktown. Damaged, patched, and declared unfit for battle, she nonetheless sailed again, carrying not just aircraft, but the hopes of a nation learning to fight back. Her brief, defiant stand became a symbol of what the American war effort would become: resourceful, relentless, and resilient. When she slipped beneath the Pacific waves, Yorktown did not vanish. She became part of the deep, a silent witness to the moment when the tide began to turn. Every ship and crew that followed into battle carried a piece of her legacy. Midway proved that wars are not won by machines alone, but by the minds and hearts behind them. It revealed that victory belongs not to the side that strikes first, but to the one that endures. And in the calm that followed the battle, as the smoke drifted across a quiet ocean, the world stood at a threshold, between despair and resurgence, between dominance and defiance. From ruin came revenge, from defeat, determination, and from the decks of a wounded carrier rose the promise of a new age, one where courage and innovation would define the future of war, and the balance of power at sea would never be the same again.